Say something.
You're the host.
I'm surrounded by the Reservoir Advisory Council, and you have a mission to bring forth a sustainable leadership culture, to create a sustainable leadership culture. And my question to you is, what does that mean? What does it look like?
You want to start?
I think sustainable leadership culture to me looks very different. It embraces diversity. I think that a sustainable leadership culture acknowledges different, not only ethnicities and gender, but also different socioeconomic levels of society. I think that leadership can be accessible to a much larger part of the population than it currently is.
And that looks very different from the leadership that we presently have, right? So naturally we think, if you're aiming to create a sustainable leadership culture, there's something unsustainable about leadership culture today.
There's even more that's unsustainable, because we're really living in a time of unexpected disruption. Mm-hmm. And we use the term societal sustainability a lot, where we're trying to think about what can we as leaders, what we as advisors to leaders, what can leaders do to create a more societal, a more stable and sustainable society globally? And what does that look like?
I think it's about being inclusive, right? So, you mentioned about diversity. I don't know that it's just the diversity, equity, and inclusion, but more so inclusive. How can we bring all of these different demands together and find solutions to support that? And I think when you talk about societal sustainability, it's truly bringing everybody to the table. We can't exclude one or a couple of groups for whatever the reasons or biases are. We have to bring folks in, because I think that's where your talent rises to the top.
Very nice. And that makes me think of, you spoke about the importance of listening. How do we listen if the voices are not diverse? Like, how do we listen to people if we're not inviting them to speak and hearing what they have to say?
Well, let me respond to that this way. Listening, equity, inclusion, I see those as really core values. And so to me, sustainability means establishing a set of core values that will transition across multiple generations of leadership, multiple changes of leadership. So just because the CEO leaves the organization, the core values don't. And they stay there, and they continue to impact both the employees, the organization, and their customers.
That's right. I think that's a great point, because when we talk about sustainability, we do need to be thinking across generations. Truly effective leaders, their impact is felt long after they're gone. And so I think we've invested so much in these individuals, and so you leave, I come in, the first thing I do is try and change everything. Right. No, that's not sustainable, and it's not building a true leadership culture, right, if it can't exist from generation to generation.
And ultimately, I think it's a huge detraction to the employees.
Yes.
Because eventually they just say, doesn't affect me, I'm done.
That's right.
What's the next change, so to speak?
Yeah.
But I think adaptation is important, though.
Yeah, sure.
All right. So change shouldn't be just change because of personality, but adaptation is important so that you can relate to the market, relate to whatever is going on, and it shouldn't be crisis driven like we experience in 2020.
Right. I keep thinking the opposite of chaos, actually, right? Yeah. Because if there's chaos, then there's uncertainty, and everybody's going, where are we going? But if there's a culture where people feel like there's certainty, which starts here, right? Yeah. That certainty of where north is on that compass, then it just gets easier.
Yeah.
I think we try to complicate it and then it just gets worse.
And that's building trust, right?
Right.
So if you build trust and a psychological safe space for
Right.
people to contribute, have a voice at the table, it truly makes a difference. But I think you talked about it earlier about fear. You can't be fearful and accomplish the resolution, right? Because you're going to be tight and you just can't maximize what your contributions are.
That's right.
Yeah.
And you think, Herb, you talked about adaptation. We talk about the word pivot's used a lot these days. And of course, if you're going to pivot, you're holding one foot solid. It's staying in place while the other one moves.
Yeah.
And that's where I think the core values come in. The core values, they stay.
Right.
That lets you pivot in the marketplace and adapt.
That's a beautiful.
Herb, you talked about the difference in the Fortune 500 companies that used to last average of 61 years back in the 50s, and now they're lasting average of 18 years. We've been talking about something that we call the Ichiwa project. There's a temple in Kyoto, and outside the gates of the temple is a little tea shop that's been in existence and serving pilgrims to the temple for 1,001 years.
Wow.
All owned by the same family all that time. We need a better way to last longer than 18 years as organizations. How do we do that? So when we talk about sustainable leadership culture, I think at the heart of it is, how can we make organizations that last longer because they're doing something vital, meaningful, and important in the society, not just for shareholders, but for the world? How do we do that?
I think, Vince, you said something really important a moment ago. I think you said organizations need to know what their North Star is.
Yeah.
And in the Kyoto Temple, they have a singular North Star vision. And it's simple. Anybody can understand it. And it's not complicated.
Yeah.
And that's what I see that's missing so much in today's companies. It's that the simplicity of this is what we do.
Well, I think purpose is a key word.
Yes.
It's-
Yes.
The North Star, they have a deep pride. I
Sure.
think 1,000 years you can only last if you're like deeply in love.
Sure.
And you have a sense of responsibility.
Absolutely.
And I think that sometimes now the reason that organizations aren't lasting as long is because there's a part of the purpose that's missing, and it's become so financially driven.
Right.
And leadership has become so much of this, kind of economic gain with many businesses and acquisitions, that purpose is missing. So
Wall Street drives that, right? In terms of that, every 90 days, what have you done for me? We have gone from relational business to transactional. And I think about the current company that I'm with. They do wonderful things. They're compassionate. They deliver a service that people appreciate. But the rest of the community outside of the families that use that service don't know about it.
Right.
So beyond the purpose, we need to also figure out a way to get the message out and get that out consistently. So it shouldn't be episodal. It should be a consistent thing that you do.
Yeah.
I'd like to add one other concept here, and it's the emotional quotient too, because so much of what drives a company seems to be a CFO saying, "Show me the numbers, show me the money," and but everybody's at the same time wanting some sort of emotional quotient, like a meaning to this. How do I connect with this?
Yeah.
And to have that as the foundation, rather than we're in this for profit. I get that, because we've all run businesses. We want to be able to sustain the business, but without that emotional quotient, then people are going, I'm not part of anything significant.
When you and I first met, I was actually working and doing some writing on the idea of MQ, which is a meaning quotient.
Yeah.
And I think that The Ant and the Elephant had just come out pretty recently.
Right.
And what I found in there was, here was a figure who wanted to move somewhere, wanted to get something going, but he had to to steer a whole elephant. He was an ant on the head of an elephant. And he had to give some sense of direction and purpose and reason for that elephant to move and to agree with his choice.
And where we all, the first question I always get with clients, the first question is, what do we do? And the first response is, that's not where we start.
No.
That's right.
Time and again, right? So it's
Let's discover. Right?
It's who do we have to be?
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, I think there's another aspect of the whole idea of sustainability, and that's the way we talk about the organization and leadership. We have one group, Wall Street, who strictly looks at the organization as a profit-generating institution. We have others who want to talk about the employee experience and human thriving, human purpose, vision, all of which is good. But too many times I see we have those conversations are separated. It's either one or the other.
Yeah.
And I think from my research, high impact organizations, those who do the best job of both, that make a lot of money and also create environments for human thriving, it's both and.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the sustainability quotient, is that we're not focused exclusively on one or the other, we're doing both.
Yeah.
You know, yesterday I was talking in the strategic planning that if you have those 5 or 6 things that you define as a strategy in terms of quality, communication, transparency, you put all of those things together and you get everybody rolling in the same direction, the bottom line will come into play.
Yeah.
If you're delivering in those other areas well, you will make money. As long as you have a good business plan, right? So,
When we talk about the deliverables of a company, we have what we call the 5 Ps. The final P is not profit, although that's part of it. The final P is payoffs.
yeah.
Profit is just one payoff of a great organization.
Sure.
And so being focused on all the other parts, as you say, actually those are the ones that start to build the profit model.
Sure.
At least for the long term, the sustainable profit.
Correct.
Yeah.
You know, it disappoints me, for example, we talk about sustainability when you talk about the green energy or sustainable energy versus what you see with BP and these other companies right now, where they're making record $30+ billion per quarter. And you're just wondering, if you have some really smart people there, why aren't they looking at those types of things in terms of applying that energy to looking at this world being sustained another whatever billion years or whatever. But it's all about the short-term gain. And I don't know what defines and how we can get folks like that to think differently.
Well, you just said it a moment ago, it's Wall Street driven.
Yeah.
When you have every 3 months analysts saying, what have you done for me today?
Yeah.
That creates a very short-term vision. So looking forward 1,000 years, if you're a publicly traded corporation.
It's
However,
nothing.
there is some interesting research out of Harvard Business School that showed that CEOs who talked more about long-term strategy on earnings calls attracted more long-term investors.
Interesting.
So you get the people who are thinking
Long-term.
at least beyond a quarter to the decade or beyond.
Yeah.
You attract the investors you need. So, but to do that, you've got to be talking in long-term strategy. Otherwise, you're right. If you get the investors who are only looking for the short-term return, they're going to run the business. I can't tell you how many CEOs I've talked to who said, "I get it, but the shareholders won't let me."
Yeah, interesting.
The shareholders will if you get the shareholders you need.
Yeah.
So we need to change the message to the world.
Yeah,
Right.
we do. That's right.
And make sure that message is consistently there.
We should stop reporting the stock market every day.
Yeah.
Because for most people, it's completely irrelevant. Yet
Yeah.
still, we do it every
Right.
single day.
Yeah, because it's that top 1% of the world that's driving what we all do.
That's right.
Yeah.
What I'm hearing is that a revolution needs to occur, a revolution in leadership. What does that revolution look like? Where does it begin?
It starts, I think, it's multiple areas. I sit on an advisory board with Concordia, and one of the things that they're doing is to bring in leadership programs or leadership education. You have to take a minor of probably 4 to 6 credits, And the idea is that you start from your freshman year. So whether or not you're going into business, or frankly, if you're going to become a physician or a nurse, the idea is that you develop leadership skills no matter what you're doing or plan to do in life. And I think that's what's going to help to make a difference in terms of decision making. That people are not just sitting back listening to that 1% for all the decisions that's being made that affects us all. We need to have people being involved so that they can really, to use the disruptive term, how do you disrupt the tradition or the systemic practices? And I think people are going to do that and make that difference. But it shouldn't be occurring, once every 10 years. It should be a consistent thing that we're doing on a daily basis to hold people accountable, hold companies accountable. And that's what we have to do, I think, differently in the educational process.
And I think that also starts at a young age.
Yes, absolutely.
And you see that with many parents that are, in terms of understanding, with young girls, to embrace, and be
science.
confident.
Yes.
Be confident in themselves and understand that the abilities are, they can do anything.
Mm-hmm.
And little boys that can do anything, or anyone coming from any background can accomplish anything. I think that it starts, of course, with the way our society, our children are raised, and then within school and education. I think that we're not focusing enough on education as a country, from elementary and on.
Yeah.
So,
John Canyon, at 4 years old, he was in pre-K, and they had a conversation in the classroom about what you want to be when you grow up. And John Canyon said that he wanted to be a ninja. And the teacher told him, no, you can't be a ninja. And he was really distraught. Came home really distraught. I was very upset with this teacher for setting limitations on what my 4-year-old can become. And I wrote her an email and let her know, actually, he can be a ninja when he grows up. He could have a YouTube channel where he's a ninja and makes a whole heck of a lot more than a teacher makes. I didn't want to be offensive, but it's just you can't, we can set limitations on our imagination and our ideals.
Sure. But yeah, I think it
tangent,
starts early on. I remember I had to go to Sunday school every Sunday when I lived in Jamaica, and it just drove me crazy because I had to walk 3 miles to church and
Uphill both
ways.
Barefoot.
In Jamaica. And it was the interesting thing though is that what I got despondent about was constantly hearing about the Old Testament, a fire and brimstone, an eye for an eye, and that just turned me off. But at the end of the day, it built a high level of morale for me and morals. And it helps me to give back. And I've been doing that since I was in high school. Always finding a way to give back or contribute back. Not necessarily just funding, but what can you do to help that other child in the schoolyard that's getting picked on? So it's from those types of exposure. I think it needs to happen from early on. And it's not just your parenting. It should be in the educational system to bring value to that. And it's not just about competition. It's not a win-lose, it's a win-win. How can we work together as human beings to, see the best dividends that affects more people than less?
It's funny you talk about reading the Bible. I was listening to Fareed Zakaria speak recently. He went to a Church of England high school in Bombay when he was young in school. And every day they would have to have, songs and sing the hymns. All the Muslims and the Hindus and the Sikhs all stood there and sang all the songs and read the Bible verses. And he said they loved it. It wasn't that they were being converted to Christianity, but they loved it. And what they loved about it was everything in the New Testament is about helping the poor and making a better world for everyone. Yeah. And that brings us back to the revolution that you asked about, is that we've got to be focused on not just how to make the billionaires more wealthy, but how to make everybody more sustainably taken care of in their lives.
Correct. Yeah. And it drives me crazy when you think about, the 1% saying, okay, how much more can we add to our $1 billion, I don't know, investments portfolio? Thank you. But the reality is that if you don't take care of the rest of the population, what you could be making if you took care of them would be so much more exponentially. Right. So there is a lack of intellect, I guess, in terms of understanding that if you take care of more people and make them live a higher quality of life, they're going to make your business so much more wealthy.
Well, and I think that's where part of the revolution is moving from sort of a scarcity mindset. There's a few leaders here and there, and there's a few investors who determine where things go, to an abundance mindset of looking around and saying, we have an enormous amount of talent that's being untapped. We have enthusiasm and energy that's going wasted. We have leadership capability. People who aren't being invited to the table, they don't get to do that. If we tap into that, we've got, as you say, we've got so much more to give and so much more to gain over the long haul.
See, that's where I think the revolution needs, I mean, for business-wise, that's the point of the revolution, is when everybody in the business has a voice, where they're invited to contribute. In my research, one of the things I discovered was that these high-impact organizations, they intentionally tap into the basic, fundamental set of capabilities that everybody on the planet has. Innovation, creativity, problem solving, service, and sacrifice. And they intentionally want to tap into that. Because when they do, they unleash an enormous amount of value, both for the employee and for the customer. And the other thing, and I'll be quiet.
Sure, no, that's fine.
Talking about a revolution, I think we can learn a lot from the military. They start out the first day in boot camp teaching basic leadership principles, and there's no organization or institution on the planet that puts as much emphasis on leadership. And when you read the data that says only a third of first-time managers get any training in leadership, all of a sudden I think we start to realize where the disconnect is at.
Harvard Business Review, and I think McKinsey, talks about the companies that their bottom line increases by probably about 19 or 20% when you talk about diversity. And in this case, they were looking at gender diversity. And you look at those companies earning so much more when you have representation by women on their boards and in their senior leadership. And that's just an example of where, if you spread this and get these other companies that don't necessarily recognize that, how much more effective we can be by spreading the wealth, right? And what you just talked about in terms of true leadership, that it shouldn't be just limited to that group that think they're entitled.
A rising tide floats all boats.
That's right. I was going to say there's a related stat to what you just gave that Dan writes about a lot. Companies that have over 70% engagement by the Gallup survey have significantly higher profits across the board. And what's the one driver of engagement? The most important one of all is the relationship with the immediate supervisor. And I can't tell you how many times I've sat with a CEO or a C-suite and said, given that, let's go down to the middle of the organization and start really putting some juice into training these young leaders or these emerging leaders to really get this. Let's get down to the base of it. And everybody goes, yeah, that's a great idea. And rarely do we see it done.
And Gallup will tell you, even before the Great Resignation, roughly 62% of folks who quit their jobs is because of those direct supervisors. Because they're not, as you said, they're not educated. They don't have continuing education. They don't have true interpersonal skill development.
It's funny. One of the things we've heard during the Great Resignation or the Great Reassessment, whatever you want to call it, and people wanting to work from home, they're going to miss the mentorship. They're going to miss the development. I'm like, how many companies actually develop their managers to be good mentors? It's sort of a mythological mentorship out there. And so I think we do have to invest in that.
I think the reason that it's not working is because there's not buy-in from the top. And that's typically the reason programs don't get implemented, because especially during the Great Resignation and around COVID, you're putting out fires as a leader.
Right.
You're not thinking about,
Sustainability.
all the time, and not all leaders, of course. Maybe this is majority or an average, however.
It's a lot of them.
It's a ton of them.
I think it's fair to say most.
Okay.
Right,
so-
that's why a revolution's needed.
Yeah. And I think, I hate to be the Debbie Downer right now, but I think with the recession that's kind of upon
Imminent.
us, I think it's a wake-up call, and it will be for many businesses, because this is the number one time, if you haven't already done so, to start investing in your culture and in your people, because right now, this recession, it's not going to be pretty on many businesses and the prospects of business if you're not already investing in your people. So this is kind of a wake-up call to start doing it now if you haven't.
That message needs to get out there, because
Yeah.
I've been in business a long time, and it's repeat cycle. They never learn. Never ever learn.
Right.
One of the first things that they do during recessions or times of hard times to the bottom line, they lay off people, particularly in the organizational development area first. They cut investments in education because those are easy cuts. And they don't realize that if you truly invest in your people, they can even be more creative in helping you bridge that gap.
And, defining moment in my career was working with FedEx. And the first 3 words that came out of their mouth was people, process, and profits. And if I could summarize kind of what we've been talking about, if we're not starting with the people, where a revolution starts, where leadership should be paying their attention to, if it's a recession or it's good times, it's always at people, and then the process. Is that actually effective? Are we doing that well? And it's almost like the profits are an afterthought. And
They're the payoff.
And it's the payoff for paying attention to the people and the process.
If you get the people in the process right, the profit ought to fall at the bottom, right?
Yeah.
With a sound business model, it should work.
But how often do we hear that they started, okay, our bottom line, we need to cut. We need
Wall
to,
Street.
Yeah.
You know what's weird about this too is that we know there's an economic change that's going to take place every decade or so, and all businesses, oh my God, we're going to have a recession. Just look at your history. Be prepared for that.
Right.
Put away money for a rainy day. Manage those things. But we don't do that. We don't think long term, or we don't think in an organized way. I know we just do the crisis management every time that we have these issues or changes.
In the last recession, CEOs everywhere were saying, we're going to cut employment or headcount 10%, 15%. One CEO said, that's ridiculous. Chris Connor at Sherwin-Williams said, you can't just make up a number. If you want to go in, then have a process of figuring where you can lean out each section of the thing. One of the things that they did was they did not lay off any salespeople. They went out and hired all the laid off salespeople from their competitors that they could find. They had those salespeople take them into their current or previous clients, and they said to those clients, we're going to help you redo your manufacturing and the paint process, and we're going to take X% out of your whole thing. And they said, well, we'd like that, but we can't afford to make that change. He said, no, you don't understand. Along with your previous salesperson, there are 15 of us around the table. These are all the engineers who run this. We'll redesign your entire painting process so that it will take half the time, be 3/4 of the cost, and they was a no-brainer. In that period, they outperformed their entire industry by 3 times.
There you go.
They didn't have a
In a
recession.
down market.
There was no recession for Sherwin-Williams.
And again, my goodness, man, just bring people together from different backgrounds or whatever the case is, especially if they were in an area where they don't have the affluence or the availability. Bring them to the table and have the discussion.
Yeah.
throw out those questions and say, hey, how can we make this better? How can we improve this?
Yeah.
Dane, you just gave me a great idea. Let's hire some of the Twitter and Meta.
Let's go for it.
There was a whole department, accessibility department for Twitter was taken.
Was
so
it 10,000 that they are laid off?
11,000 at Meta, and it's almost 8,000 at Twitter.
Yeah, it makes no sense, in terms of how we think.
So let me make a comment, Vincent, what you said. People, process, and profit.
Yes.
So Sherwin-Williams put a lot of focus on people as well as process.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I've done a lot of process improvement work. I've done a lot of lean work. Invariably, the reason, in fact, the research says that like 80% of most lean engagements, process improvement engagements, produce no value whatsoever. And from my experience, one of the core reasons, a couple actually, but one of the core reasons is that senior leadership says, oh, process improvement, that's Vince's job.
Yeah.
Instead of
It's the organization.
it's the organization's job,
Right.
Yeah.
and they want to do a lot of one-offs, and but it doesn't work. You have to incorporate the entire organization, the entire leadership into that culture of valuing people. Process. We could always make the process better, and when we do that, we'll have greater profitability, more sustainable profitability, and our customers are going to be happy, and our people are going to thrive.
Yeah.
What a novel idea.
I think you said it earlier too, when you were saying that leadership, you got to have buy-in. If you don't have your leaders walking the walk, checking in, seeing if you have the tools, modeling what your expectations are, it's going to fail every time.
So like Ina was just saying a moment ago, what creates that buy-in long-term is the culture.
Yeah.
It's not
Purpose.
a question of do we buy in. The culture says you will buy in. And that's, I think, the value of culture. It creates that DNA. This is how we do things around here.
And here we've come full circle to a sustainable culture. How did we do this?
I want to ask one more question. Speaking of sustainable culture, culture's about to change organizationally for every organization. I read recently that by 2030, 30% of employees are going to be Gen Z.
Yes.
Zoomers, we call them.
Yeah.
Yes. How do core values come into working with this new generation? How often would an organization revisit its core values? The Gen Z values are very different than traditional values. So how do you approach this transformation that's about to take place?
Can I jump in real quick and say mine, and everybody can? I saw that in when I was running operations. We had roughly three different generations here. We talk about this all the time, that we need to have a conversation and bring all three generations in the room to understand the differences and teach each other, learn from each other. If you do and check all these surveys, you'll find out that we still have not done that. Even though we've been talking about it for the last 40 years, we have not learned how to connect these individuals because it's too much work. They see it as a cost that they are not willing to put forth on. They did a recent survey where they're talking about Generation Z, which when you think about what has happened with their parents, right? I think it was Generation X, that they went through the recession period where they lost a ton of money. They're seeing now that we need to behave differently. So the attitude is, it's all about me and my survival. While in the meantime, if you have a conversation with them, however, they'll get your work done quicker than most other generation, but they're also going to get on their own gig as well. So if you learn these things, you can put this together and find out how to blend these generations.
So I think that brings us, what you just said is great, and it just brings us back to the idea of continually working on a sustainable leadership culture. And one of the things that makes any system sustainable is continual evolution as it goes. I think this has been a phenomenal conversation. Emma, thank you so much for leading, and thanks all of you. What a great talk.